825 and Wessex is victorious at the Battle of Ellendon, ending the Mercian supremacy. This victory was quickly followed by Wessex annexing all of these southern kingdoms. All of this occurred under the rule of King Egbert, who had previously been exiled to Francia by the Mercian king Offa. After Offa's death, Egbert returned to Wessex, probably with the help of Charlemagne, and was crowned king in 802. His reign was one of Wessex's most successful. 4 years after his victory, Egbert invaded Mercia and managed to force the Mercian king Wiglaf into exile. Soon afterwards, he invaded Northumbria and received the submission of its king. Egbert is thus considered to be an overlord of Britain at this point, but like most things it didn't last, because by 830 Mercia had revolted against him. Mercia couldn't pry the southern kingdoms from Wessex, and East Anglia became an independent kingdom again. Egbert's later rule did contain further setbacks though. For example, in 835 Kent was heavily plundered by Vikings, and the next year he was defeated by the Danes here. However, in 838 he did win a victory over them and their Dumnonian allies. Attacks by Vikings, who are commonly referred to in sources as Danes, increased dramatically over the following decades. The majority of the Vikings who attacked the Anglo-Saxons during this period were from Denmark, hence Danes. Some were from modern-day Norway though, and those Vikings were referred to as Norse. Quick fact, the term Viking actually comes from the Old English term Vikinger, which means pirate. So the increase in activity culminated in the 865 Great Heathen Army, which landed here in East Anglia. The difference with the Great Heathen Army, called so because the Vikings were pagans, and the previous raiding parties was that now the Vikings were in Britain for conquest. Within 4 years of their landing, East Anglia and Northumbria had been defeated. East Anglia was hence ruled by Danes and Northumbria was split in half, the northern half remaining under the rule of the Angles. Wessex at this point was ruled by King Ethelred, the fourth eldest son of Ethelwulf, Egbert's successor. In 870 the Great Heathen Army camped at Reading, here, before invading Wessex. Ethelred was victorious against the Danes, inflicting upon them their first defeat. The Danes bounced back and in 871 defeated the West Saxon forces at the Battle of Basing, roughly here. To make things worse, King Ethelred died and was succeeded by his brother, Alfred, better known nowadays as Alfred the Great. Ethelred actually had a son called Ethelwald, but Alfred was chosen to be king instead. This is because the crown did not necessarily pass from father to eldest son. In Wessex, the Witan, the king's advisory council made up of high-ranking nobles, was involved in the succession. Most of the time, they simply rubber-stamped the king's appointed heir, who was often the eldest son. Alfred was chosen over Ethelwald because Ethelwald was still a child at this point, and the situation with the Vikings required stability. The fact that Wessex could appoint kings without having to suffer a civil war each time was one of the reasons it stood as firmly as it did. One thing that ought to be remembered is that the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes were not mortal enemies that could never coexist, and rival claimants to a throne could and did enlist Vikings for support. Alfred began his reign by bravely paying the Vikings to leave. Thus, the Great Heathen Army went north to pillage Mercia before splitting in half. One half went north to settle Northumbria, and the other, led by a man called Guthrum, went south back to Wessex in 876. The Vikings didn't really do much, and in 877 they split up again to divide Mercia, leaving an even smaller force under Guthrum, which launched a surprise attack into Wessex the next year. Alfred was forced to flee to Athelney in the marshes of Somerset, which is here. He waited there as his forces were mustered across Wessex, and after assembling they fought the Danes at the Battle of Edington. This was a decisive victory for Alfred. The subsequent peace treaty between Alfred and Guthrum did several important things. First, Guthrum was baptised, taking the name Ethelstan with Alfred as his adopted father. Secondly, Alfred accepted Danish occupation of these lands, whilst in return these lands were considered Alfred's, with Alfred notably gaining western Mercia. Incidentally, the dividing line between the Danish and Saxon parts of modern-day England roughly follow an old Roman road called Watling Street. Having won a major victory and secured a peace, Alfred began the task of securing his kingdom from further Viking raids. There were three major ways he did this. The first was to reform the army. Alfred changed the way that troops were raised so that only half of the levy troops were active at any time. This is important because most soldiers were taken from farms to fight, meaning that there were less people to grow and harvest crops. Thus, the army was smaller but more efficient, and importantly, Wessex had a standing army at all times, meaning it could respond to raids immediately. The next change was a naval build-up, which made it harder for the seaborne Vikings to land on Wessex's long coastline. The final, and arguably the most important change that Alfred made was the creation of a system of burhs, which were fortified towns. There were roughly 30 of these, and they were manned by the newly reformed army. These burhs acted as garrisons and sanctuary in case of Viking attack, but they also grew as important economic centres. Some burhs, such as Winchester, were already protected by Roman walls and only required manning and repair. Others, such as Wallingford, were built from scratch. Each burh was assigned a number of hides, which were measurements used to denote the value of land. It's a very complex system, and a hide does not represent a certain amount of land, but its value. Land used for cattle would be worth more hides than that used for growing wheat. For the defence of burhs, 1 man was required from each hyde. Also, burhs did not have a standard size. For example, the burh at Winchester required 2,400 men for its defence, whereas the one at Southampton only required 150. The details of the system come from a document called the Burgh or Hydage, which indicates that in order to man all of the burhs across Wessex, 27,000 men were required, which is an impressive amount. Alfred did not just oversee the innovations in the army, he was also responsible for great changes in the nature and appearance of kingship. For example, Alfred began to brand himself as not simply the king of Wessex, but as the king of the Saxons, thus making him king to even those who lived under the Vikings. To secure Mercia compliance, Alfred married his daughter Ethelfled to the Lord of Mercia, Ethelred, but importantly, Mercia did still have some autonomy. Alfred did show good faith to the Mercians when he captured London in 886, and instead of incorporating it into Wessex, he handed it over to Mercia. Mercians had little reason to rebel against Alfred for 2 reasons. The first was that Alfred was known for being a just king, and the second was that by allying themselves with Wessex they had better protection from Viking incursions. One consequence of Viking raiding and invasion was the destruction of monasteries, which in turn had a major effect on learning and education. Major monasteries such as Monkwearmouth, Jarrow, Lindisfarne and Iona had all been sacked by Vikings. Many learned men were killed, their libraries burned and their wealth transported back to Scandinavia. This led to what Alfred described as a sharp downturn in learning, which he sought to correct. To do this, he began inviting some of the most learned men across the kingdom to his court to help. It is likely that Alfred was exaggerating just how bad learning had become, since many of his new advisors were from Mercia. For example, Plegmund, who would later become the Archbishop of Canterbury, and at least 3 others were Mercians. Some were from foreign kingdoms too, such as Grimbald, a Frankish monk, and Asser, a Welsh monk and the most famous of Alfred's court intellectuals. This revival of learning is often called the Alfredian Renaissance, and unlike the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, Alfred was personally involved in the production of some of its literature. Much of this Renaissance was centered around language, specifically when a person should use Latin or use English. It was decided that most people should learn to read and write in English, with only the clergy needing to study Latin. Alfred was himself learning Latin during the period of peace with the Vikings, and he used his newfound knowledge to translate some works into English. Alfred sums up his reasoning for translating documents into English as such. It seems better to me that we should turn into language that we can all understand some books which may be most necessary for all men to know. He was referencing religious works which would teach good morals to his subjects. It's important to remember that many saw the Viking invasions as a punishment by God for bad behaviour, and to Alfred, reinvigorating learning was one way to counter this. A quick side note on language. One aspect of Anglo-Saxon culture which differentiates it from its continental European contemporaries is the prevalence of the vernacular language, that is, Old English, and its use instead of Latin. Other kingdoms, such as Francia, had their own vernacular languages, but things like law codes and treaties were always written in Latin, whereas in Anglo-Saxon England a significant number were written in Old English. One such document was Alfred's Law Code, produced sometime in the latter half of his reign. Alfred interestingly begins his law code demanding that all men keep the oaths they've made, which may imply that this has been an issue. The Alfredian Renaissance did not just copy old works, but also saw the creation of new ones. The first was Asser's Life of Alfred, which, whilst probably a propaganda piece designed for distribution to the Welsh, is vitally important for understanding Alfred as a person. Another document that was most likely created around this time was the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is essentially an annual list of major events. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was kept and updated for many years, and the version of the Chronicle found at Medeshamsted, modern-day Peterborough, was updated well into the 12th century. The Chronicle, alongside Bede's Ecclesiastical History, are by far the 2 most important sources for Anglo-Saxon England, and without them very little would be known about the years between the Roman withdrawal and the Norman conquest. Wessex wouldn't be at peace forever, and sure enough, it wasn't. In 892, another great army landed in Wessex. Thanks to the new system of burhs, the Vikings were not able to get anywhere near as far inland as they had in the 870s. Unfortunately for Mercia, they had few burhs, and so the Vikings marched through their territory and eventually into Wales, which at this point was still divided into smaller kingdoms, most or all of whom had pledged their allegiance to Alfred. This was the last major Danish incursion into the territory of Wessex before Alfred's death in 899. Alfred had thus managed to turn Wessex from a kingdom struggling to resist the Vikings to the sole Anglo-Saxon power. It was on top of the foundations built by Alfred that the Royal House of Wessex would go on to be the first Royal House of England. Alfred saw himself as the architect of an England, but be aware that this was never realised in his lifetime. The northern half of Northumbria still remained a nominally independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and the continued obedience of Mercia was no sure thing. Nowadays, Alfred occupies a place in the English national psyche as the founder of the nation. Of course, most of the information which survives from his reign was written in his court by his intellectuals, and so his reputation should be taken with a grain of salt. Irrespective of all of this, his achievements certainly pushed Wessex in the direction that made sure that this land would ultimately be English and not Scandinavian. We're often told to avoid great man history where possible, but in the case of Alfred it's difficult to strip him of this title, and it's worth remembering that of all the kings of this land, He is the only one to have ever been the Great. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. Books are in the description below and feel free to subscribe if you want.